The morning briefing room buzzed with the usual pre-deployment tension, but something felt different. Captain Vera Kowalski sat in the back row, her fingers drumming silently against her flight suit as she watched the intel officer point at satellite imagery of the disputed border region. 3 weeks of reconnaissance flights had turned up nothing but desert and wind, yet here they were again, preparing for another routine patrol that everyone knew wasn't routine at all. The other pilots whispered among themselves, shooting glances her way that ranged from curious to dismissive. She'd only been with the squadron for 6 months, transferred in from a training command that most of them considered a career dead end. What they didn't know, what her personnel file carefully omitted, was that her previous assignment had been far from routine instruction. The classified stamps on her record told a different story, one that even she sometimes wished she could forget. Kowalski, the squadron commander's voice cut through the chatter. You'll be flying tail-end Charlie today. Stay back, observe, learn. The casual dismissal in his tone wasn't lost on anyone in the room. A few snickers rippled through the assembled pilots. She nodded curtly, her expression unchanged, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 3 years of combat missions in the most contested airspace on the planet, and they had her flying sweep position like a nugget fresh out of flight school. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so frustrating. As the briefing concluded and pilots began filing out toward the flight line, she remained seated for a moment longer, studying the mission parameters on her tablet. Something about the target area nagged at her, a cluster of coordinates that seemed familiar, though she couldn't place why. The terrain features, the elevation markers, even the approach vectors triggered a memory she couldn't quite grasp. Outside, the desert heat shimmered off the tarmac in waves that made the horizon dance. F-16s sat in perfect formation, their gray paint schemes already absorbing the punishing sun. Ground crews moved with practiced efficiency, conducting final checks and loading pylons with training ordnance. Everything appeared normal, routine, unremarkable. But Vera Kowalski had learned long ago that normal was often an illusion, and routine was when things went sideways fastest. She pulled her helmet from her flight bag and ran her thumb over the faded call sign painted on the side, 2 words that once struck fear into enemy pilots across 3 different theaters. Today, it felt more like a ghost from a life she'd left behind. The mission brief called for a simple 4-ship formation flight along the border, gathering intelligence on reported smuggling routes. Standard stuff, or so it seemed. What waited for them beyond the mountains would test everything she'd learned about flying, fighting, and the price of being underestimated. The engines began their familiar whine as she walked toward her aircraft, the sound that had been the soundtrack to her life for nearly a decade. Today, it felt different. Today, it sounded like destiny calling. 20 minutes into the flight, the routine began falling apart. The lead pilot's voice crackled through the radio with barely controlled tension. Control, Viper 1-1. We've got multiple unknowns inbound from the northeast, low and fast. Request immediate identification. Vera banked her F-16 slightly left, bringing the threat bearing into view through her HUD. Even at this distance, she could make out the distinctive delta-wing silhouettes cutting through the morning haze. Her blood went cold. Those weren't smugglers or border patrol aircraft. They were military jets, and they were flying in attack formation. Viper Flight, this is Control. Stand by for threat assessment. The controller's voice carried that particular strain that came with consulting higher authorities, who were suddenly very interested in what had been a routine mission 30 seconds ago. The lead pilot was still trying to make sense of what he was seeing when Vera's radio crackled to life on the squadron frequency. Lead, this is 4. Count 6 bandits, bearing 045, altitude appears to be Angels 5. They're not squawking friendly. Her voice was calm, professional, but her hands had already begun the unconscious weapons systems checks that came from muscle memory built in deadlier skis. Copy 4, maintain position and... The transmission cut off as the lead pilot finally saw what she'd been tracking. Jesus Christ. Control, Viper 1-1, we need immediate support. These guys aren't here for a friendly chat. Through her canopy, Vera watched the approaching aircraft spread into a classic envelopment pattern. Whoever was flying those jets knew exactly what they were doing, and they hadn't stumbled into this airspace by accident. This was coordinated, planned, and very likely hostile. Her squadron mates were still trying to process what they were seeing when the first missile launch signature bloomed on her radar warning receiver. The characteristic tone filled her helmet, a sound she'd heard too many times in places where hesitation meant death. "Viper flight, defending," she called out, pulling her stick hard left and diving toward the deck without waiting for authorization. Behind her, she could hear the confused chatter of pilots who had never faced a real missile in anger, their training suddenly feeling inadequate against the reality of combat. The incoming weapon streaked past her previous position, its proximity fuse detonating harmlessly in empty air. But there would be more, and her squadron mates were still flying in neat formation like they were heading to an air show. In approximately 30 seconds, some of them were going to die unless someone took charge of this situation. Viper lead, recommending immediate defensive maneuvering and weapons authorization, she transmitted, her voice cutting through the radio chatter with the authority of someone who had been here before. The response came not from the lead pilot but from a new voice on the frequency, calm, measured, and carrying the unmistakable tone of command authority. "All Viper aircraft, this is Overlord. Weapons free. Repeat, weapons free. Defend yourselves accordingly." The first dogfight lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Vera knew because she'd been counting, the way she always did when things went kinetic. By the time the smoke cleared and the remaining hostile aircraft had disengaged toward their own border, 3 things had become very clear to everyone monitoring the engagement. First, this had been a probe, a carefully planned test of response times, tactics, and capabilities. Second, her squadron had been completely unprepared for real air-to-air combat, their peacetime training exposed as inadequate when faced with pilots who shot back. And third, the quiet pilot they'd been treating like a rookie had just saved all their lives. "Viper 4, Viper lead." The squadron commander's voice over the radio sounded different now, stripped of its earlier casual authority. "Nice flying back there. Real nice flying." She didn't respond immediately, too busy scanning her instruments and checking her remaining fuel state. The engagement had burned through her reserves faster than anticipated, and they still had to make it home. But more importantly, she was running through everything she'd observed during the fight: aircraft types, tactics, engagement profiles, escape routes. Intelligence that would matter in whatever came next. Because there would definitely be a next time. This had been too organized, too professional to be an isolated incident. Someone was testing their defenses, and today's probe had revealed exactly how vulnerable they really were. "Control, Viper flight," the lead pilot transmitted. "Request priority handling for landing. We've got battle damage assessment required and some very interesting gun camera footage to download." As they flew home in loose formation, Vera caught glimpses of her squadron mates looking over at her aircraft. The respectful distance they now maintained wasn't just professional courtesy. It was the recognition that they'd been flying with someone whose experience level they'd badly misjudged. Her F-16 showed the scars of close-quarters combat, scorched paint from a near miss, a few small holes from cannon rounds that had come too close for comfort. But she was alive, her aircraft was flyable, and most importantly, all 4 Vipers were heading home instead of scattered across the desert floor. The radio chatter had died down to essential communications only, each pilot lost in their own thoughts about how quickly a routine mission had turned into a shooting war. For most of them, it was their first real taste of combat. For Vera, it was just another day at the office, though she'd hoped those days were behind her. As the home airfield came into view, She could see the emergency vehicles positioned along the runway, the crowd of ground personnel gathering to assess damage and debrief the engagement. Within an hour, this incident would be classified and analyzed by people whose names she'd never know, turned into intelligence reports that would shape policy decisions in rooms she'd never see. But right now, all that mattered was getting her bird on the ground in one piece and preparing for whatever questions were coming next. The debriefing room felt different this time. Gone was the casual atmosphere of the morning brief, replaced by the sterile intensity of post-combat analysis. Intelligence officers she'd never seen before sat alongside her squadron mates, their laptops open and digital recorders running. Someone had deemed this engagement significant enough to bring in the professionals. "Let's start with the initial contact," the senior intelligence officer said, his eyes moving between the assembled pilots. "Who made first visual identification of the hostile aircraft?" Three fingers pointed toward Vera. She kept her expression neutral, but inside she felt the familiar weight of unwanted attention settling on her shoulders. This was how it always started, with questions that seemed routine but carried implications that would follow her for months. "Captain Kowalski," the officer continued, consulting his notes. "You called the initial threat bearing. How did you identify them as hostile before anyone else in the formation?" The question hung in the air like smoke. She could feel her squadron mates watching, waiting for her answer. The truth was complicated, involving classified training and experiences that weren't supposed to exist in her official record. The safe answer was simpler. Aircraft were flying in attack formation, no IFF response, approaching from known hostile territory. "Standard threat indicators, sir." The intelligence officer made a note, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with the response. "And your defensive maneuvering during the initial missile engagement. That was unusually aggressive for someone with your listed experience level." There it was, the question she'd been dreading. Her official record showed training assignments and routine peacekeeping deployments. Nothing that would explain why she'd reacted like a seasoned combat pilot facing her 100th engagement rather than her first. "Training kicked in, sir. Simulator time and emergency procedures." Another note, another skeptical look. But before he could follow up, the squadron commander leaned forward. "Sir, with respect, Captain Kowalski's tactical decisions saved lives today. Her experience level is less important than her results." The support surprised her. 6 hours ago, the same officer had been treating her like a liability. Combat had a way of clarifying perspectives, but she wondered how long this newfound respect would last once the adrenaline wore off and the paperwork began. "Of course," the intelligence officer agreed. "We're just trying to understand how someone with limited combat experience managed to." He consulted his notes again. Quote, "Execute textbook defensive maneuvers while maintaining situational awareness sufficient to direct coordinated counterfire." End quote. The room went quiet. Her squadron mates were looking at her with expressions she recognized, the mixture of curiosity and respect that came when people realized they'd been making assumptions about someone they barely knew. It was a look she'd hoped to avoid in this assignment, but circumstances had made hiding impossible. "Sir," she said finally, "sometimes training is more comprehensive than it appears on paper." The call came at 3:47 hours, dragging Vera from restless sleep into the harsh fluorescent lighting of base alert status. Her phone buzzed with the terse message that every military pilot dreaded and secretly craved. "Immediate recall. Report to squadron ready room. Combat status." She dressed quickly, muscle memory guiding her through the familiar routine of flight suit, boots, and gear bag. Outside her quarters, she could see other pilots hurrying through the pre-dawn darkness, their faces grim in the security lighting that never quite chased away the shadows between buildings. The ready room buzzed with controlled chaos. Maps covered every available surface, marked with symbols and coordinates that told the story of a rapidly developing situation. The intelligence officer from yesterday's debrief stood at the front of the room, flanked by officers she didn't recognize, people whose presence here meant this was bigger than a border skirmish. "Ladies and gentlemen," the intelligence officer began, "yesterday's engagement was the opening move of a coordinated campaign. Satellite imagery confirms military buildup along a 200-mile front, with advanced fighter aircraft and surface-to-air missile systems moving into forward positions." The room absorbed this news in silence. Yesterday's probe had been successful from the enemy's perspective. They'd tested response times, tactics, and capabilities. Now they were preparing to exploit whatever weaknesses they'd discovered. "Current intel suggests they're planning a major incursion within 72 hours. Our job is to prevent that from happening." He clicked to the next slide, showing aircraft assignments and mission parameters. "This will not be a peacekeeping mission. This will be combat operations in contested airspace against a peer adversary." Vera studied the tactical display, her mind automatically processing attack vectors, threat envelopes, and defensive positions. The enemy had chosen their timing well, positioned during a period of reduced Allied presence, with weather conditions that would limit satellite surveillance and complicate air operations. "Captain Kowalski," the intelligence officer said, and she felt the room's attention shift to her again. "Given your performance yesterday, you're being moved to lead position for Viper flight. Your new call sign for this operation is Iron Wolf Actual." The silence that followed was profound. Her squadron mates stared at her with expressions ranging from surprise to something approaching awe. Iron Wolf wasn't just a call sign. It was a legend in military aviation circles, associated with combat achievements that had become classified footnotes in air warfare history. "Sir," the squadron's previous lead pilot said carefully, "Iron Wolf has been retired for 3 years. That call sign belongs to Captain Kowalski," the intelligence officer finished, "who has been flying under administrative cover since her transfer to this command. Her actual combat record remains classified, but given current threat levels, operational security considerations have been waived." The pieces suddenly clicked into place for everyone in the room. The quiet competence, the instinctive tactical knowledge, the way she'd handled yesterday's engagement like she'd done it 100 times before because she had. They'd been flying with a legend, and none of them had known it. The walk to her aircraft felt different this time. Ground crews who had barely acknowledged her presence 6 hours ago now moved with the particular deference reserved for pilots whose reputations preceded them. Her F-16 had been reconfigured overnight, additional fuel tanks, updated electronics packages, and weapons loadouts that spoke to the seriousness of the mission ahead. "Ma'am," her crew chief said as she approached, "Bird's ready for whatever you need her to do, full bag of tricks loaded and tested." His tone carried respect that hadn't been there before, but also concern. Everyone knew what Iron Wolf's return to active combat meant. She ran through her pre-flight inspection with practiced efficiency, her hands moving over familiar systems while her mind processed the tactical situation. 4 aircraft against an unknown number of hostiles in airspace where backup might not arrive in time to matter. The kind of odds that had once been routine, but felt heavier now after 3 years of pretending to be someone else. "Iron Wolf Control." The radio crackled to life as she settled into her cockpit. "You're cleared for immediate departure. Weather's holding, but intel suggests window of opportunity is closing rapidly." "Copy Control. Iron Wolf flight check-in." "Iron Wolf 2 ready." "Iron Wolf 3 ready." "Iron Wolf 4 ready." Her wingmen's voices carried a tension she recognized, the mixture of anticipation and fear that came before combat operations. They were good pilots, but yesterday had been their first real engagement. Today would determine whether they were ready for what was coming. Iron Wolf flight, taxi for immediate departure. Mission parameters are weapons free beyond the buffer zone. Rules of engagement are defensive only unless directly threatened. She paused, letting that sink in. But if someone shoots at you, shoot back. And don't miss. The acknowledgments came back sharp and professional. Her squadron had learned a lot in 24 hours, but the real test was still ahead. As they rolled toward the active runway, Vera caught her reflection in the canopy glass, the same face that had once been featured in classified briefings, as an example of what precision air power could accomplish in the right hands. Today, those hands would be tested again, along with everything she'd learned about flying, fighting, and leading people into situations where mistakes were measured in lives lost rather than points deducted. The tower cleared them for takeoff into a sky that looked deceptively peaceful. But beyond the horizon, radar signatures were moving, and someone was about to discover that Iron Wolf hadn't lost her edge during 3 years of teaching cadets to fly. The first sign of trouble came 40 miles out from the target area, when her radar warning receiver began painting threats from multiple directions simultaneously. The enemy had learned from yesterday's encounter and adjusted their tactics accordingly. Instead of a simple probe, this was a coordinated ambush designed to overwhelm defensive responses. Iron Wolf flight, multiple bandits bearing 270 through 030, various altitudes. Count at least 12 contacts. Her voice remained calm, but her fingers had already begun the familiar dance across weapons controls that preceded air-to-air combat. Jesus, Iron Wolf 3 muttered over the radio. 12 against 4 isn't exactly fair odds. No, Vera replied, adjusting her radar scope to get a better picture of the threat array. It's not fair at all, for them. The confidence in her voice wasn't bravado, it was the product of experience in situations where overwhelming odds were just another tactical variable to be managed. She began vectoring her flight into a defensive formation that would maximize their advantages while minimizing exposure to concentrated attack. The key was to avoid getting trapped in a turning fight where numbers would eventually prevail, instead using superior technology and training to engage targets selectively. Iron Wolf 2 take the northern group. 3 and 4 maintain defensive spacing and engage targets of opportunity. I'll handle the southern approach. Her tactical directions came quickly, based on a real-time assessment of enemy positions and likely attack vectors. The first missiles began flying 30 seconds later. Modern air combat happened at ranges where pilots never saw each other directly. It was a deadly chess game played with radar signatures, electronic countermeasures, and weapons that could kill from beyond visual range. But the principles remained the same as they'd been since the first fighter pilots dueled over European battlefields more than a century ago. Iron Wolf actual, good kill on Bandit 003, her wingman reported. Southern group is disengaging. -2, they're repositioning for another pass. Stay sharp. Vera had seen this tactic before, feint a withdrawal to draw defenders out of position, then re-engage with fresh angles of attack. All Iron Wolf aircraft maintain defensive positions. This isn't over. Her radar scope confirmed her suspicions. The enemy aircraft had pulled back just far enough to regroup, but their electronic signatures indicated they were still actively tracking her flight. Someone on the other side was coordinating this engagement with the kind of tactical sophistication that suggested professional military training rather than irregular forces. Iron Wolf actual control. Be advised, satellite imagery shows additional hostile aircraft launching from forward bases. Estimated time to your location, 15 minutes. 15 minutes to finish this engagement and get clear before facing fresh opponents with full weapons loads. The tactical math was becoming increasingly unfavorable, but retreat wasn't an option, not with friendly ground forces depending on air cover that wouldn't arrive if her flight abandoned the mission. The turning point came when Iron Wolf 4 made a mistake that nearly cost him his life. Eager to score his first air-to-air kill, he broke formation to pursue a damaged enemy aircraft, leaving himself exposed to attack from multiple directions. Vera saw the trap developing and reacted without conscious thought. 4. Brake left now. Her F-16 dove toward the deck, afterburners lighting as she positioned herself between her wingman and the incoming missiles. The maneuver put her in extreme danger, but it was the kind of split-second decision that defined combat leadership. The enemy missiles locked onto her aircraft instead of her wingman's, their infrared seekers drawn to the massive heat signature of her afterburning engines. She had perhaps 10 seconds to defeat 2 incoming weapons while maintaining enough airspeed to avoid becoming an easy target for the fighters that were certainly maneuvering to finish her off. Her countermeasures deployed in a carefully timed sequence, chaff and flares designed to confuse the incoming weapons' guidance systems. But modern missiles were sophisticated, and decoying them required more than just electronic jamming. It required precise flying at the edge of what her aircraft could handle. The first missile detonated close enough to rattle her teeth, its proximity fuse triggered by chaff that bloomed exactly where she'd calculated it would. The second weapon stayed locked longer, forcing her into a climbing spiral that bled off airspeed and left her temporarily vulnerable to cannon fire from the pursuing fighters. Iron Wolf Actual, you've got 2 bandits closing from your 7 o'clock, her wingman called out. I'm engaging, but you need to get some separation. She rolled inverted and pulled through a split-S maneuver that brought her back toward the Earth at an angle that would either save her life or end it, depending on whether she could pull out before impacting the ground. The G-forces pressed her into her ejection seat with enough force to make her vision narrow, but her hands remained steady on the controls. The pursuing fighters had expected her to climb away from the threat, not dive directly toward it. Her unexpected maneuver gave her the few seconds she needed to reverse the tactical situation, bringing her own weapons to bear against opponents who were suddenly defending instead of attacking. Her missile launch was textbook perfect, fired at minimum range against a target that had no time to maneuver defensively. The enemy aircraft disintegrated in a fireball that was visible for miles, sending a clear message to the remaining hostile pilots about the consequences of underestimating their opposition. Iron Wolf Flight Control. Satellite confirms hostile reinforcements have turned back to base. Immediate threat appears to be neutralized. The controller's voice carried relief that mirrored what everyone was feeling. But Vera knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Today's engagement had been more sophisticated than yesterday's probe, suggesting an enemy that was learning and adapting. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and the tactical advantage of surprise was now gone. The after-action briefing stretched late into the evening, with intelligence analysts dissecting every aspect of the day's engagement. Gun camera footage played on multiple screens, while officers debated tactical implications and strategic assessments. But the real story wasn't captured in the data. It was written in the faces of pilots who had survived their first real air war. The enemy demonstrated improved coordination and tactical flexibility, the senior analyst concluded. They're learning from each engagement and adapting their approach accordingly. We should expect continued escalation. Vera sat quietly in the back of the room, letting the discussion flow around her while she processed her own observations. The enemy pilots had shown competence bordering on professionalism, with aircraft performance that suggested access to modern systems and training. This wasn't a regional militia group. It was a military force that someone had invested serious resources in developing. Captain Kowalski, the base commander said, drawing her attention back to the briefing. Your tactical leadership today prevented what could have been a significant loss of aircraft and personnel. The decision to engage outnumbered opponents was aggressive. The comment carried undertones she recognized, appreciation mixed with concern about her willingness to accept risk. Peacetime military culture emphasized caution and calculated responses. Combat operations required leaders who could make life-or-death decisions in seconds, even when the odds were unfavorable. Sir, the mission parameters were clear. Air superiority was required to protect ground operations. Withdrawing in the face of enemy action would have compromised that objective. Understood, but 12 against 4 represents significant tactical disadvantage. A more cautious commander might have requested reinforcements before engaging. Yes, sir. A more cautious commander might also have allowed enemy forces to establish air dominance while waiting for backup that might not have arrived in time. Her response was respectful but firm. She'd fought this battle with superiors before, the eternal tension between acceptable risk and mission accomplishment. The room fell silent. Everyone present understood the implications of her statement. In modern warfare, air superiority was often the decisive factor. Losing control of the airspace above friendly forces was a death sentence that no amount of ground-based air defense could prevent. Point taken, the commander said finally. Your experience in these matters is considerable. It was as close to an admission as she was likely to get that her official record didn't reflect the full scope of her combat background. The classified operations, the victories that couldn't be acknowledged publicly, the reputation that had been carefully buried under administrative assignments and training commands. Sir, if I may, Iron Wolf II interjected. Ma'am's tactical decisions today were the reason we all made it home. Whatever her background, she knows how to fight these guys. The endorsement from her wingman carried weight that official reports couldn't match. Combat created bonds that transcended rank and protocol, and the pilots who had flown with her today understood something that personnel files could never capture. The secure communication arrived at 21:30 hours, delivered by courier to her quarters with instructions that it be read immediately and destroyed within 1 hour. The message was brief, but its implications were staggering. Iron Wolf, your tactical assessment requested for strategic planning. Report to Building 847 at 600 tomorrow. Dress blues. Tell no one. General Morrison. General Morrison. The name alone was enough to make her hands shake slightly as she read the message. Commander of Air Combat Command, architect of modern air warfare doctrine, and one of only 3 people who knew the complete truth about her previous assignments. If he was calling her in personally, the situation had escalated beyond regional conflict into something approaching full-scale war. She burned the message in her bathroom sink, watching the classified words turn to ash while her mind raced through possibilities. Building 847 was the strategic planning facility, where decisions were made that affected military operations across multiple theaters. Her presence there meant they wanted more than just tactical input. They wanted someone who understood how to fight and win against peer adversaries. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by dreams of aerial combat and faces of pilots who hadn't made it home from missions she'd led years ago. The weight of command never really left. It just got buried under routine assignments and paperwork until circumstances dragged it back to the surface. At 5:45 the next morning, she stood in front of Building 847, wearing her dress blue uniform with ribbons that told only part of her story. The classified commendations weren't displayed, nor were the foreign decorations that acknowledged contributions to operations that officially never happened. But the visible awards were impressive enough to make the security guards straighten unconsciously as she presented her identification. Captain Kowalski. The aide who met her in the lobby was young, probably fresh from the Pentagon, with the nervous energy of someone working for general officers. The general is expecting you. Conference room 3, second floor. The elevator ride felt longer than it was. When the doors opened, she stepped into a world of strategic planning that she'd hoped to avoid for the rest of her career. Maps covered the walls, showing global threat assessments and force deployments that painted a picture of rising tensions across multiple regions. This wasn't about a border skirmish. It was about preventing a larger conflict that could reshape the balance of power for decades. General Morrison looked exactly as she remembered, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, with the bearing of someone who had commanded forces in combat and understood the true cost of the decisions he made. When he saw her, his expression softened slightly with what might have been relief. "Iron Wolf," he said simply, "we need to talk." The conference room contained maps and displays that showed the scope of a crisis she was only beginning to understand. What had appeared to be isolated border incidents were actually part of a coordinated campaign spanning 3 countries and involving military forces that intelligence agencies were still trying to identify. "The pilots you engaged yesterday weren't local militia," General Morrison began without preamble. "Aircraft performance data suggests advanced training and access to weapons systems that shouldn't exist in that region. Someone is providing significant military support to what we initially assessed as irregular forces." Vera studied the tactical displays, recognizing patterns that triggered memories of classified briefings from her previous life. The coordination, the equipment, the tactical sophistication, it all pointed to state-level involvement disguised as regional conflict. The kind of proxy warfare that could escalate rapidly if not contained. "Sir, the engagement profiles suggested professional military training. Response times, formation flying, weapons employment, these weren't amateur pilots." "Agreed, which brings us to why you're here." He clicked to the next slide, showing force deployments across the region. "Current Allied air assets in theater are insufficient for sustained combat operations against a peer adversary. We need combat-experienced pilots who can train others and provide tactical leadership under extremely challenging conditions." The implication was clear. They wanted Iron Wolf back on active combat status, leading missions that would determine whether this regional conflict remained contained or exploded into something much larger. It was the kind of assignment she'd spent 3 years trying to escape. "General, my current assignment is training command. I'm not cleared for operational deployments." "Your clearances were reactivated 6 hours ago. Your assignment orders are being cut as we speak." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Vera, I know you wanted out of the combat side of this business. I know the personal cost has been significant, but right now, you're one of only 3 pilots in the entire Air Force with the tactical experience necessary to lead this kind of operation." The weight of his words settled on her like a familiar burden. She'd walked away from operational flying because the cost, in stress, in relationships, in sleepless nights haunted by decisions that meant life or death for people under her command, had become unbearable. But she'd also walked away because she was one of the best at what she did, and that skill came with responsibilities that couldn't be ignored when lives hung in the balance. "What's the mission?" "Establish and maintain air superiority over a theater where enemy forces have sophisticated air defense systems and numerical superiority. Train Allied pilots in advanced tactics while conducting active combat operations. Hold the line until reinforcements arrive and diplomatic solutions can be explored. In other words, do the impossible with insufficient resources while teaching others how to stay alive in the process." The kind of mission that had made Iron Wolf a legend and nearly destroyed the person behind the call sign. The flight line at 400 hours had the surreal quality of a dream sequence. Rows of F-16s being prepped for combat missions that would determine the fate of a region. Ground crews moved with the efficient urgency that preceded major operations, loading weapons and fuel, while pilots conducted final briefings in ready rooms that buzzed with nervous energy. Vera stood before a group of 12 pilots, representing the best available talent from 3 different Allied air forces. Some were combat veterans with deployment experience, Others were recent graduates of advanced training programs who had never fired a weapon in anger. All of them understood that the next few weeks would test everything they'd learned about flying and fighting. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had led similar missions before. "The tactical situation has deteriorated overnight. Enemy forces have established air defense networks that will make our job significantly more difficult. Success will depend on precise coordination and adherence to tactical protocols that many of you haven't encountered in previous operations." The maps behind her showed threat envelopes, engagement zones, and target priorities that painted a picture of complex combat operations in heavily defended airspace. The kind of environment where small mistakes had large consequences, and tactical excellence was the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Our primary objective is air superiority. Secondary objectives include close air support for ground operations and interdiction of enemy supply lines. Rules of engagement are weapons-free in designated zones, but positive identification is required for all targets. Questions?" A young pilot from the Allied contingent raised his hand. "Ma'am, intelligence reports suggest enemy pilots have advanced training. How do we assess their actual capabilities versus our own?" The question demonstrated good tactical thinking. Understanding enemy capabilities was essential for developing effective countermeasures, but it also revealed the questioner's lack of direct experience with peer adversaries. "Lieutenant, yesterday's engagements provided useful data points. Enemy pilots demonstrate competence in formation flying, weapons employment, and tactical maneuvering. However, they also showed predictable patterns that can be exploited if we maintain tactical discipline and avoid emotional decision-making." She clicked to gun camera footage from the previous day's combat. "Note the approach vectors and engagement sequences. Professional execution, but within doctrinal parameters that suggest standardized training rather than innovative tactics. Our advantage lies in tactical flexibility and superior situational awareness." The pilots absorbed this information with the intensity of students whose final exam would be conducted at Mach 1 with live ammunition. Some made notes, others asked follow-up questions, but all of them understood that the woman briefing them had accumulated tactical knowledge that couldn't be learned from textbooks or simulators. "Final point," she concluded. "Combat operations create stress that can degrade decision-making and tactical performance. Trust your training, communicate clearly, and remember that bringing everyone home is more important than individual glory. We're a team, and teams survive when everyone does their job." The mission launched at first light, with Iron Wolf leading a mixed formation of F-16s and F-18s toward an airspace that intelligence analysts classified as highly contested. Enemy air defense systems had been detected throughout the target area, along with combat air patrols that suggested significant aerial opposition. Iron Wolf flight control. Weather is clear, winds calm. Threat picture shows multiple SAM sites active along your route of flight. Recommend aggressive maneuvering on ingress. The controller's voice carried professional calm, but everyone understood the implications of operating in an environment where surface-to-air missiles were actively hunting for targets. Vera adjusted her flight path to minimize exposure to known threat envelopes while maintaining formation integrity. Leading 12 aircraft into combat required constant tactical awareness, monitoring threats, coordinating defensive maneuvers, and making split-second decisions that would determine mission success or failure. Iron Wolf Actual, Raptor 2-1. We're tracking multiple airborne contacts bearing 180, altitude unknown. Request permission to investigate. One of her allied pilots had detected potential threats on the southern approach, requiring immediate tactical response. Negative, Raptor 2-1. Maintain formation and assign sectors. If contacts turn hostile, you're cleared to engage, but don't go hunting. Her response reflected hard-won experience about the importance of tactical discipline in complex air operations. Individual initiatives could compromise overall mission effectiveness if not carefully coordinated. The first surface-to-air missiles launched, while her formation was still 50 miles from the target area.